Hello, everybody, and welcome to the new agent training in service on the experiential learning model. We had some technical difficulties when we delivered this on Monday, and so I am re-recording this in service for those of you who are not able to watch it live. And so for those of you who are watching the recording, at the end of the presentation are instructions for how to receive in-service credit. By the end of this presentation, I hope that you'll take away a couple of things. I hope you'll be able to define the steps in the experiential learning model, to be able to identify and make use of strategies and techniques to use each of those steps. And I hope to increase your value for the importance of teaching using the experiential learning model. So what is the experiential learning model? On the slide here, you can see an overview of the model with the 5 steps here. I'm going to add a 6th for you just to complicate things a little bit. This is the model that the National 4-H Council has adopted to guide 4-H programming across the country. It is rooted in a constructivist approach to education. So folks like John Dewey were instrumental in defining the constructivist approach. And really that holds that learning is not something, knowledge is not something that you acquire, that you gain. It's something that you do. It's about the process of creating memories and patterns of retrieval in the brain. So as I told you on the last slide, there are 5 recognized steps to the experiential learning model. But I believe that recent advances in our understanding of the brain, particularly the adolescent brain, and how it processes and assimilates new information and builds those neural networks for retrieval and transfer, I believe that there are some things that we have to do before we begin instruction. And so I've added a stage to this called setting the stage. And really, these are those things that we want to do to get our kiddos ready to engage meaningfully in the learning experience we're going to provide. These are those sort of pre-instruction things. And I think there are 3 of them. I think we need to gain attention. I think we need to present them with our outcomes. And I think we need to help them connect to their prior knowledge on our topic or subject area. Let's look at these 3 a little closer. I'm going to work throughout this presentation with a couple of examples from published lesson plans that you can find on the Tennessee 4-H website. This particular example comes out of publication W409 called Origami Boxes. And so here in setting the stage, we're looking to gain students' attention, and we do this by asking them to complete a KWL chart. So asking them, what do you already know about geometry and origami? What would you need to know about those things to be able to effectively fold particular shapes and then be able to calculate the surface area? And then near the end of the lesson, we come back and we complete the L as students reflect on what they've learned throughout the course of the lesson. The second example is W408, and that's what's shaking. And in this lesson, we walk kiddos through turning milk into butter. Right? And so the engagement piece here asks students to do a modified think, pair, share, where they reflect on what they already know about states of matter and give some examples of changes in states of matter. So these 2 activities are designed to sort of get students focused on the topic that we're going to be discussing, to figure out what they already know so that we can build on that knowledge and we can correct misconceptions where they occur. And then I'm going to deliver my objectives to them much in the same way that I just did with you all. Today we're learning about making butter, and by the time you end today, you're going to understand the following things about states of matter. I would encourage you to pause for a moment and think about some of those ways that you engage learners to get them ready to go. And if that's not something you've ever considered, I would encourage you to pause and brainstorm some ways you could do that. Engagement activities do not have to take a tremendous amount of time. I taught a lesson once on air pressure, and I started the lesson by popping a balloon and then asking once clearly that got their attention pretty quickly because it was loud, and then asking them to help me understand why the balloon popped, what happened, and we used that discussion to springboard into our lesson on air pressure. So after you've done those pre-instruction types of things, setting the stage, getting their attention, giving them their objectives, and connecting to prior knowledge, now we move into the actual experiential model. And the first step in that is to have the experience. We know that the brain learns through patterns and creating memories. And so with the experiential learning model, we are seeking ways to create new memories for students. So putting them in learning experiences where they can engage all of their senses to touch, see, feel, hear, smell, right? Motion and movement, active types of activities. These can be huge and elaborate. And the example I give here is I could throw a bunch of kids in a bus and we could head to Johnson City and we could travel across the state of Tennessee every 100 miles, stopping to take soil samples all the way over to Memphis. And then we could sit down with all of our soil samples from across the state and make some comparisons about what we found in the soil. That's huge. It's elaborate. It would create all kinds of memories. It would engage all 5 of their senses. It's also cost prohibitive, and realistically, how many of us want to spend 7 days on a bus with students driving across the state collecting dirt? I think that sounds fun, but I've been told I'm a little bit weird like that. So an alternative example that I could use to accomplish the same objectives is to collect some soil samples on my own, or send emails out to other agents across the state and ask them to collect samples and mail to me. And then I could sit in my club meeting with samples of those soils already in jars for students to touch and smell and analyze. I could do that in about 15 minutes, right? So sometimes experiences are large scale and elaborate. Sometimes they're quick and small, but they are ways we engage the senses. Here's the example from the origami boxes lesson, where we give them sheets of origami paper and we walk them through how to fold one, and then we let them create some of their own. Then we teach them about surface area, and through the rest of the lesson we're going to draw these connections between calculating surface area and folding origami shapes. In the butter making, the experience is where they actually take those materials and they shake it until they get butter out of their product. In this process, they're also recording data and observations. So I would encourage you to think about what are some of the most popular experiences that you do with your 4-H club members. And I'm betting that the more hands-on, the more experiential the activity is, the more engaged your students are, the more they remember it. One of the agents on the Inservice on Monday gave the example of working with kids in an urban setting, and she brought in a live horse. And for most of them, it was the first time that they had seen and touched a live horse. That's something those kids will remember forever. So as then she starts beginning to teach about breeds and anatomy and those types of things, the kiddos have some personal experience to draw from. So step 1 was experience with our pre-instruction before that. After the experience comes the opportunity to share. Each kid will engage in that experiential learning opportunity in a slightly different way. They'll come into that with their own background knowledge, their own prior knowledge and misconceptions, their own baggage, if you will. And so allowing kiddos to share their experiences with others in the group is a really powerful way for them to start to make meaning, because they can begin to see where their experience was unique and where it's shared. And in that shared commonalities, we begin to identify those key concepts that we're trying to teach. Again, this stage can be super elaborate and can take 3 club periods, or it can take about 3 to 5 minutes of guided, structured discussion. I can just lead a debriefing session with the students to ask them about their experiences. I can pair them and have them interview one another. I can ask them to do a video confessional where they record their own thoughts and processes and then share those on my county Facebook page, perhaps. Lots of different ways to share. Let's look here. With origami boxes, it's just a question. This is a guided discussion that'll take as few as 3 to 5 minutes, or we could stretch out for a half hour, and asking kiddos to identify what they learned that interested them the most in that process of making their origami creations and calculating surface area. In the What's Shaking lesson, we are asking students to think through the chemical properties of how the cream changed into butter. And we can do that with a thumbs up, thumbs down, or other strategies to ask them to share their experiences. Is this a stage that you do with your students? Do you give them opportunities to share what they experienced and their thoughts and feelings and reflections with other group members? The next step is process. We've done our pre-instruction of setting the stage. We've given our students the experience. We've allowed them to share. And now it's time to start making meaning out of my personal experience and what I've heard of my group members' experiences as well. This is where I really start to reflect and analyze and figure out how what I'm learning can be applied in other settings. Again, this can be done through both structured activities or through discussion and debriefing with the kiddos with some very focused, intentional discussion questions. The origami box example here is getting kids to recognize that the origami shapes they've created are 3D shapes, right? And that 3D shapes are comprised of 2D shapes added together. So if I add 6 squares together, I can create a cube, right? A 2D circle in 3D is a sphere. And so once I've gotten them to kind of make this connection that calculating surface area of 3D shapes is really the addition of calculating surface area of each of the 2D shapes that comprise the 3D shape, now I want to see if they can make some real meaning of that. And so I asked them to create a short haiku about what they've learned about calculating surface area. One of the reasons I love little activities like this is it doesn't take a ton of time and it's not a crazy long assessment. A haiku is a Japanese style of poetry with 3 lines. The first line has 5 syllables, the second has 7, and the third has 5. And what that forces students to do is synthesize what they've learned into their own words to show me the meaning that they're taking out of it. It allows them to be a little bit creative, but it also requires them to be super intentional about their wording because they can't just ramble until they feel like they got it right. They have to make their message directed and intentional. In What's Shaking, we do just a structured discussion, right? Why does it matter? Changes in chemical and physical states of matter. Why does it matter? Why do we care? Why is this important? And why do I need to know it? And I might ask them to give me some examples, right, of where they see changes in matter elsewhere in their lives, in situations where that impacted their lives. If I'm out in the middle of a frozen lake ice fishing, and the physical state of that matter changes from solid to liquid, I'm in a whole bunch of trouble, right? And so I need to understand what would cause that solid ice to turn into liquid water. So getting kids to understand those connections. How do you plan for instruction that empowers members to reflect on their experiences and to make meaning out of the experiences that you've created for them? Think about how you do that in your current club activities. If that's not something that you typically do, Think of some ways that you could begin to do that in small ways that don't take a ton of time. Once we've done our pre-instruction things of setting the stage, gaining their attention, giving the objectives, and assessing prior knowledge, we provide them with the experience. We give them opportunities to share with their friends. We promote a structured means by which they process that information to make meaning out of it. And now I'm ready to move into the generalize. This is where I really get them to start connecting what we did to life in the real world. This is where we answer the so what question. When am I ever going to use this skill in my real life? Let's look at some examples. In looking at calculating the surface area of 3D shapes, I can ask students to think about ways that they could do that more easily instead of always having to memorize complicated formulas for surface area. If I know how to calculate the perimeter or the area of a 2D shape, how do I use that to calculate surface area of a 3D shape? And with what's shaking, I can ask students to think through where they've seen these other examples of states of matter. We talked about that a minute ago as process in terms of getting them to recognize why it mattered. Here I'm asking them, okay, so where do you see this? I'm asking them, how can you use what you know about this principle in your daily life? If I want to take ice cream to a picnic and it's the middle of July, simply setting the container of ice cream in my back seat is probably not my best plan, right? I need to take a cooler with ice. Why? Because I need to keep that solid from changing into a liquid. So think about activities you've used in the past to allow students to generalize their experience. This is one of those areas where we really see kids struggle. That ability to take what they've learned in one context and transfer it to a whole new situation. And one of the examples I always give is if I am working with kids in a teen living class and I give them a recipe to cook and it requires them to measure out ingredients, and the recipe calls for 1.5 cups, but the only measuring tool they have is a third cup, and I ask them to convert that, they freak out because they don't know how to convert that, despite the fact that it's just working with fractions, and that's a skill that they've been doing since 3rd or 4th grade. But they don't connect working with fractions in math class to cooking in my teen living class. And so it's through these generalized activities that we help them draw these connections between using a skill or a concept in one setting and where they might encounter it again. And then for my final stage, step number 5 is apply. And this is where students actually show me that they've mastered it. We've experienced it, we've shared it, we've processed it, we've generalized it. Now show me you can do it. Now go out and find a 3D object in your yard when you get home, calculate the surface area of that 3D object, and bring me a picture and your measurement when you get back to class tomorrow. Let's look at examples from here. Asking them to think about, we've talked about a whole bunch of 3D shapes in the origami lesson today, but where do you see those and how do we use them, right? Getting them to recognize that most of the structures that we see around us are simply combining 3D shapes together. My desk is a rectangle on top of 2 standing rectangles, right? And helping them see how everyday objects are 3D shapes with 2D shapes built into them. And with the What's Shaking lesson, asking them to think of how they could design other experiments to record and measure changes in states of matter. So getting them to think through that design process of, if I wanted to record a physical change of state of matter, how would I go about setting that experience up or that experiment up? I would say this is the step that we miss most frequently because we run out of time. But it's also the step that we are really rich in 4-H. If I've got kids that are in a horse club, who are going to compete in a hippology bowl. I mean, everything that they learn in my club meeting, they are going to apply in that bowl competition. But I don't make that connection always crystal clear for them. That's a really easy example, but think about what we do with students in some of our community clubs where we work on STEM concepts with them and we build hot air balloons or we build rockets or robots with them, and how incredibly cool and fun that is. But going through that share, process, generalize, and apply stages allows them to break down the components of building a rocket to understand the scientific principles behind it. So when they run into those scientific principles in school, in their science class, or in other real world settings, they know how to make sense of it and they can continue to successfully apply the skill and concept. So, I hope you're walking away with an understanding that there are 5 steps in the experiential learning model. We include one at the beginning for pre-instruction, and that is pre-instruction, the experience, share, process, generalize, and apply. I hope you've come away with some ideas of strategies or techniques that you can use for each of those steps, and that this presentation allows you to understand how the experiential learning model can be leveraged to enhance the power of your instruction in your club meetings. If you have questions, please feel free to email them to me at jennifer.richards@utk.edu. And if you're watching this recording for in-service credit, there are 2 questions below. Number 1, what is a haiku? And number 2, what were the 6 steps of the experiential learning model discussed in this presentation? If you'll simply email those to me, I will make sure that you get super credit for attending this in-service. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.